Hello there, faithful listener. You've tuned in to Season 7 of the Bible Explained podcast. So make sure to grab your cup of coffee, because today we are going to be discussing the book of 2 Samuel. Happy Friday, faithful listeners. I hope you all are excited for the weekend and have some fun things planned as well. Let me know what those things are. You can find my contact information listed in the description of this episode. And also, if you have a prayer request that you just need to talk about or need somebody to pray for you, I'd be more than happy to write you down in my little prayer journal and pray for you. And also, if your prayer requests end up becoming answered, I'd also like to hear about that as well. For those of you who have sent me prayer requests in the past, let me know if any of those prayer requests have been answered. Now, before we begin today's episode, I do have an exciting announcement. My goal on Ko-fi has been met. So thank you so much to everybody who participated in helping P40 Ministries reach that goal. I am so thankful to everybody. So thank you very, very much. I greatly appreciate it. And for those of you who did contribute to that goal on Ko-fi, you also are going to receive the exclusive content that my sister and I are putting up on Ko-fi as well. The first episode is now up on Ko-fi. Make sure to check it out, because it was a really great conversation I had with my sister about Bethel music, about Chris Tomlin, about Jeff Goldblum, about inheritances, and all sorts of other cultural things that are going on right now that are just kind of crazy. And we'll be having conversations like that pretty regularly. So if you want to be able to access that extra content on Ko-fi, make sure to become a member on Ko-fi and check all of that out. We are going to be reading 2 Samuel 1, verses 17 through 27 today. Just a quick recap. David has just found out that Saul and also David's best friend, Jonathan, has just died. He found out from an Amalekite man who probably lied about the entire situation. The Amalekite claimed that he actually killed Saul, when most likely it was not the Amalekite who had killed Saul, but Saul, it says, actually fell on his own sword and died. So Saul, yes, was dead, but David, thinking that the Amalekite was telling the truth, actually killed the Amalekite for treason against Israel. And so now David is in this mourning period with all of his men. And we're going to read this song that he writes today in verses 17 through 27. So grab your cup of coffee or a cup of tea to share with me as we read this portion of scripture. As usual, I'll be reading out of the WEB. David lamented with this lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan his son, and he commanded them to teach the children of Judah the song of the bow. Behold, it is written in the book of Jashar. Your glory, Israel, was slain on your high places. How the mighty have fallen. Don't tell it in Gath. Don't publish it in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised triumph. You mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain on you, and no fields of offerings. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled and cast away. The shield of Saul was not anointed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, Jonathan's bow didn't turn back. Saul's sword didn't return empty. Saul and Jonathan were lovely and pleasant in their lives. In their death, they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. You daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you delicately in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold on your clothing. How the mighty have fallen in the middle of this battle. Jonathan was slain on your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. You have been very pleasant to me. Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war have perished. This is the first song we see David writing after several years of living in the Philistine region. We don't know of any psalms that David had written during his time living with the Philistines. But now that David has found strength in God again, he is back to writing his poems and singing his songs. So when he finds out that Saul dies, he writes this very beautiful poem for Saul and for Jonathan as well. And he actually commands all of Judah to learn this song also. Because now that Saul and Jonathan are dead, David is going to gain a lot more power and a lot more men. And so David has a lot of influence already. So he commands all the people of Judah to learn this song and to perform it. It's called the Song of the Bow. And it is written in the book of Jashar, is what it says. Now, the book of Jashar is actually mentioned one other time in the book of Joshua. And the book of Jashar was basically just a book of ancient poems that the Hebrew people wrote. And along the way, it got lost. And so a lot of people think that the book of Jashar is one of the lost books of the Bible. Now, personally, I don't agree with that thought process because I think that all of the Bible is inspired by God. And secondly, like if you were reading any other book, like in your library that was not the Bible and it referenced another book in it, would you think that that book was not complete because it referenced another book? No, you wouldn't. You would just be like, oh, this book I'm reading is referencing this other book. That's all you would think. And books do it all the time. I was just reading a book the other day that referenced another book in it. That is what books do. The Bible is a book. And just because it references this book of Jashar does not mean that the Bible is incomplete and the book of Jashar should be in the Bible. And you're going to see other books referenced in the Bible as well that aren't in the Bible. That I still hold the same viewpoint for moving forward, just to throw that out there. So David wrote this particular poem in the book of Jashar, which is also here in scripture. It says, "Your glory, Israel, was slain on your high places. How the mighty have fallen." So on the mountain of Gilboa, which is a high place in Israel, Saul died. He fell. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. And that is the phrase that David continuously repeats in this little poem. He says, "Don't tell it in Gath. Don't publish it in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice and the daughters of the uncircumcised triumph." So he's saying, don't spread this knowledge around. Otherwise, the Philistines and all of the enemies of Israel are going to become arrogant and excited over the demise of Israel because their king has fallen. So don't publish this all over the place. Don't talk about it. Otherwise, people might become arrogant. He says, "You mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain on you, and no fields of offerings. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled and cast away. The shield of Saul was not anointed with oil." Now, of course, Mount Gilboa was where Saul had died. And so David is even telling Mount Gilboa in a way, mourn for Saul. Saul fell on Mount Gilboa. So Gilboa, you also must cry for Saul. Don't let the dew or the rain nourish your fields. Because Saul died there, the shield of Saul was not anointed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, Jonathan's bow didn't turn back and Saul's sword didn't return empty. He says, even though Saul and Jonathan have died, that doesn't mean that their lives were empty. It doesn't mean that what they were accomplishing up on Mount Gilboa meant nothing. They still were great warriors. They still were mighty. But then David says something kind of interesting here. Saul and Jonathan were lovely and pleasant in their lives. In their death, they were not divided. Now, most people reading Saul's history in the Bible would not consider him a pleasant person. But yet David says this about Saul. Why would David say this? Well, there's a few thoughts. It could be that, looking at David, he really did have a lot of esteem for Saul. Even when Saul was trying to capture and kill David, David still thought Saul was great. Like he really liked Saul from the very beginning. And so maybe David truly did think of Saul as an overall pleasant person for the most part, but he could have also thought of Saul as maybe a good dad towards Jonathan. Because don't forget that David's father kind of abandoned and forgot about David, but yet Saul did not abandon or forget about Jonathan. And so maybe in a way, David appreciated that aspect of Saul not ever abandoning Jonathan. Now, of course, we know that Saul and Jonathan did have their history of problems as well. But it could just be because of David's dynamic at home with his father that he appreciated the way that Saul maybe fathered Jonathan. And so maybe that's what David is trying to say here, that Saul and Jonathan were lovely and pleasant together, in their lives as father and son. Now, the last thing that this could have been is just David doing his best to give honor to Saul. Even though Saul had not really been a pleasant person in his life, there were times maybe that David had seen Saul being pleasant. And so he was remembering those times and just trying to give Saul as much honor as he possibly could in this song. He says, in their death, Saul and Jonathan's, they were not divided, which is true. Saul and Jonathan died on the very same day. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. You daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in delicate scarlet, who put ornaments of gold on your clothing. Now, the one thing I am noticing about this psalm, or poem really, is it doesn't really mention God in it, which is kind of interesting. And I'm not really sure why, if I'm being 100% honest. The only thing that I can think, and this is my own opinion, is that maybe the reason David wasn't mentioning God is because Saul really did not have a heart for God, and David knew that. And so once again, maybe David was just trying to give honor to Saul as best he could and didn't mention God because Saul had never really followed God in his lifetime. It just could also be that maybe David wasn't thinking about that because this was like a funeral song for Saul as well. I don't know. But it says, you daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you delicately in scarlet and who put ornaments of gold on your clothing. Now, what David could be meaning here is either that Saul was good for Israel and provided many beautiful things to Israel and allowed Israel to prosper to the point where the women of Israel were actually able to afford ornaments of gold and outfits of scarlet, maybe. Could be that. It could also be saying that Saul himself was an ornament of gold and scarlet clothing, like something beautiful for Israel. Or maybe this just means that Saul clothed his own daughters in these beautiful things. How the mighty have fallen in the middle of the battle. And so now David shares his portion about Jonathan specifically. Jonathan was slain on your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. You have been very pleasant to me. Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen and the weapons of war have perished. So this is another thing where people are like, oh, Jonathan and David had a special relationship, a sexual relationship. But that is not what this means. And Israel would have known that. And I don't think David was trying to publicize his romantic feelings towards Jonathan in this song and then make all of Israel sing this song as well. That was not what David was doing here. He was saying that Jonathan was the best friend he ever had. He calls him his brother. My brother Jonathan, not my lover Jonathan, my brother Jonathan. You've been pleasant to me. Your love to me was wonderful. And I think a lot of people just really have a hard time understanding friendship type of love. Unfortunately, people nowadays don't really have friendships like Jonathan and David were able to experience, that like brotherly affection and love, or sisterly affection and love. For me, I do have a best friend who I love very deeply, and I tell her I love her, and she tells me she loves me. And to me, that's not abnormal, because I do love her like a sister. And in some ways, I like hanging out with her on occasion more than I like hanging out with my husband. And that's no offense to my husband. I love hanging out with him too. But I like hanging out with her because she's a girl and she can give me a different kind of encouragement than my husband can give me. And that's what David is saying here. He's saying, my brother Jonathan, I am distressed because you have died. You were so pleasant to me. Your love for me was great, passing the love of women. And I mean, look at David's relationships. He didn't have the best track record with women either. And so maybe David truly did feel this way, that he would rather hang out with Jonathan on his day off than hang out with whoever David was currently having a fling with. Because we know that David married and slept with a lot of women in his lifetime. And so David probably really did feel like hanging out with Jonathan was more beneficial to him than hanging out with whatever fling was next in David's life. So this song is not David coming out of the closet. It's just David showing this bond that he had with Jonathan that unfortunately many people have never been able to experience in their lifetime, a friendship to that level. Now, before I end today's episode, why would David write all of these nice things about Saul? I think for 3 reasons. The first reason being that, once again, David had respect for Saul and for Saul's position as king. And David knew that a king would bring prosperity to Israel. So David just had respect for the role as king. I think secondly, because David trusted in Yahweh, that David was able to get past his feelings of hurt, anger, and bitterness towards Saul in this moment, and was able to think back to a better time and write about Saul, who really did do a lot of good things for Israel during his lifetime. That's the second reason. And then the third reason is that David was a very humble person in general. Like genuinely humble. He came from a humble background and maintained that humility for most of his life. He did not think of himself as somebody so great that he needed to rejoice over the fall of Saul. So David gave honor to Saul as the king because David was humble and did not think that he was beneath, writing this poem for Saul or something like that. So I think those are the reasons why David wrote this poem for Saul. And of course, we can understand why he wrote it for Jonathan as well. But generally, I think that David is somebody to emulate, specifically when it comes to his humility and also his ability to get over hurt and bitterness because of his faith in God. Alrighty, faithful listeners, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your Friday and a great, sunny, beautiful weekend. I will see you guys bright and early Monday morning for another episode from 2 Samuel. Happy listening, and God bless.